really much less to do with directly holding to account the people who perhaps were, whoever that, were responsible for 9/11. So 9/11 and Osama bin Laden has become a pet issue, and Osama bin Laden was a pet terrorist who had gone wrong, and I think the world has suffered.
Well, so much has been said on this topic. What new thing do you think you're exploring through your novel, do you feel?
Well, as a writer, I can certainly try to reflect my own research, and which is personal, as well as living in the West and working amongst so many different organisations which are community-based, as well as, politically motivated, and the zeitgeist at the ground level is prevent has failed, and so on. All the subsequent efforts by the British Americans and to portray themselves as upholding democracy and freedom across the world. I'm sorry, that line just simply isn't bought by the Muslim youth, particularly today. That's my own personal experience and research, and the novel highlights this issue, because Jimmy, who's the second, third generation Muslim kid who gets radicalised and goes towards violent extremism, says, well, I'm not British, I'm not a Paki, I'm not any of these things. He has this core lack of identity. He doesn't believe the line. He doesn't buy it. He doesn't, and if you tell somebody like that you're either with us or against us, as George W. did, and we're on a crusade, well, you put them in a corner. And somebody who's disenfranchised, alienated already, this is not at all in any way an excuse for violent extremism, but it is a reflection of the zeitgeist as I see it on the ground amongst the youth today.
If we come to Andrew, one of the tenets of Stop the War Coalition was the attack on civil liberties, and saying we're going to stand against that, as well as predicting there would be an increase in Islamophobia and anti-Muslim hatred. Where do you see things 10 years on? Do you think it's been proved right, or do you think Stop the War Coalition has actually helped to prevent some of the worst excesses?
Well, I think on the major issues, Stop the War has been proved right. In fact, on the most major of all, where we said at the time that what happened on 9/11 was a crime but not an act of war. Now, just recently, the former head of MI5, Elizabeth Manningham-Buller, has said she agreed with us. And when we set up the Stop the War Coalition...
Did she actually say in those words that she agreed with Stop the War Coalition, or
no,
she happened to come out with a similar analysis?
Same thing. No, and I think probably even in retirement, heads of MI5 aren't allowed to explicitly agree with Stop the War Coalition. But the fact is that what was said by what was then regarded as a minority has proved to be right. And we did say at the founding meeting of Stop the War that we would also campaign to protect civil liberties and to oppose any racist backlash, which has mainly, of course, been directed against Muslims in this country. And one of the things that I'm personally proudest of in relation to Stop the War Coalition and all the work we've done over the 10 years is the very strong alliances we've built with British Muslims and the British Muslim community, the fact that we're able to work side by side with Muslim men and women and have a mobilisation of British Muslims on like has never been seen before. And I think that has helped to challenge the Islamophobic prejudices in our society, and has helped to build an alliance to stand against the, particularly after 2005, the quite aggressive moves by then the Labour government, carried forward today by the coalition government, to scapegoat and demonise British Muslims, based on, and including an absolute refusal to even consider the possibility that it's British foreign policy that is playing such a part in antagonising Muslims, and of course not just Muslims, in this country.
And of course we've seen the rise of the English Defence League since then as well. Do you think there's a reluctance now for people to come out on the streets, or do you think now is a time for people to reassert where they stand on these issues?
Yes, I think that's absolutely right, and I think that's why the protest or the demonstration on Saturday is so important, because it is 10 years on from the indiscriminate war that has taken place in Afghanistan, in which tens of thousands of civilians have died as a result of our activities, apart from the United States and other countries. And I think it's very important that we continue to express those views, the views of the majority, of the population. And I think that the movement which has been built over the last 10 years with the Stop the War Coalition, with C&D and the British Muslim Initiative, the wider Muslim communities, that has the political significance of that is absolutely outstanding. And the fact that those organisations have remained in alliance, continuing to have political expression, is very, very significant. And I think that now more than ever, really, it's important to continue to express those views, particularly with the economic crisis coming along and organisations like the EDL and others on the far right perhaps attempting to scapegoat immigrant communities around the economic problems. It's absolutely important that decent people in Britain, right-thinking people, oppose those kinds of analyses and developments which seek to target minority communities quite wrongly. And we have to actually put the blame for problems where the blame lies. And it's not with ordinary British people, whatever their origins, it's with government policies over many decades.
Mm-hmm. Jonathan, in your book, you outline the historical context of what's gone in Afghanistan. What do you think some of the lessons are for the UK right now?
Not to intervene.
Succinctly put.
The history of Afghanistan shows that foreigners can be quite successful at invading, but they're not successful at occupying. You know, sooner or later, and usually sooner, there will be resistance. It'll be armed resistance, and they won't be able to control the country. After all, it is a very mountainous country, and most people live in the rural areas where it's difficult to, to get to, and so to kind of suppress them is quite difficult. And so all that foreigners can do is the sort of garrison strategy which the Russians had and the Americans and the British have now, which is to occupy the main towns, try and keep communications going over land between the main towns, but essentially in the countryside area you've got no opportunities. So as I said at the beginning, not to intervene is the main lesson. But I think the other really important point is that there is an element of a civil war going on in Afghanistan. It isn't just foreigners coming in versus the Afghans. There is in that country a history of people trying to modernize the country, trying to bring it forward and to remove oppression of women and all these other terrible things, get literacy going. And there is often a very fundamentalist backlash against it from the countryside. And that is very disheartening. But the crucial thing now, I think, is not only for the foreigners to withdraw, but for the Afghans to get together and have proper talks and produce hopefully some form of government of national unity in which the Taliban would take part as well as everybody else.
Well, of course, most observers admit that the Taliban will have some power-sharing role ultimately. But before we even get there, there's been a devastating impact on Pakistan, its neighbour, in a way that perhaps in the previous wars we didn't see. And now we're hearing calls for more intervention in Pakistan, never mind less intervention in Afghanistan. Are we seeing a situation like Vietnam and Cambodia where other countries get sucked in when we see failure of imperialism in one country? Well, again, coming back to the Russian experience, the Russians said, and we know now from Politburo documents which have been released since the collapse of the Soviet Union, the Soviet military at one point were saying the only way we can try and win this war is to seal the border with Pakistan, and that would require 250,000 men, and we just cannot do that because the people were coming in from bases and refugee camps and so on in Pakistan. But the Russians didn't try the cross-the-border attacks. They didn't have drone attacks on what was getting the Pakistani government to bomb their own people.
Yes, they didn't do that either. So it's got much worse. This war is much worse than the Soviet war in terms of its ramifications. But, I mean, obviously you have to get all these surrounding countries as well. So you need to have talks at least 4 levels. You've got to be at the local level. There should be local ceasefires. That NATO should be slowly trying to deal with the local power brokers, which includes the Taliban in Helmand and Kandahar, and having ceasefires. So you have local talks, you have national talks, you have regional talks, which all the countries come together, and then some sort of international guarantees, I think. But the crucial thing is Afghanistan has to be neutral and non-aligned, and that's what everybody in the surrounding countries say. And yet the Americans, even if they pull out all combat troops by the end of 2014, as they say, want to have what they're now negotiating, a strategic partnership agreement, which will allow Americans to stay there under some other guise, advisors, trainers, engineers, whatever, which is impossible. You cannot have a neutral country with foreign troops in there. So all the troops have to get out. So 2014 is just a fake date because Obama is actually trying to negotiate to keep them there indefinitely.